This is an audio short story, No Matter What, by Jim Pope, read by Quack McMullard. Chapter 2.
No Matter What, Chapter 2. It was a long flight home, so Paul had plenty of time to think. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. As the hours slowly ticked by, he came to the conclusion that Janet would never gain her freedom through the legal system, and that he would have to take decisive action. In other words, he would have to break her out of prison. He had no experience or skills to take on such a task. He had never even had a fight, so how could he think he could break someone out of prison? Well, the first place to start with any endeavour is with a list. So he started writing down everything needed, as well as all the skills he would need. Before he could make that list, he would need to know how he would do it. He remembered seeing a Russell Crowe movie about breaking his wife out of prison. In that film, he hacked the prison computer and faked his wife's medical file to make it look like she was about to die, so that the prison would move her to a hospital, where it would be easier for him to break her out. He dismissed this idea, as this country would be unlikely to move her to a hospital. Then there was The Great Escape, where they dug a tunnel, or Chicken Run, where they built a plane. But these were silly ideas, but the thought of them brought a smile to his face. He then remembered a film, maybe a Charles Bronson film, where a helicopter was used to fly in and land in the prison exercise yard, and then fly away, which sparked a memory of that actually happening in real life. So he settled on that as a working idea. After thinking it through for a few hours, Paul now had a working idea. He would fly a helicopter into the prison exercise yard using smoke bombs as a distraction. He would then land a few kilometres from the prison and transfer to a motorbike, thereby blending into the local population. He would ride the bike to a small commuter airfield, then fly a light plane at low level out over the ocean before climbing enough to tandem skydive to a yacht. Then all he would need to do would be to sail to the Western Australian coast and safety. A list of things needed looked pretty big. Helicopter, motorbike, light plane, yacht, cars. Now there's a fair bit of money in that list. Then there's the skills list. Flying a helicopter and plane, riding a motorbike, sailing, skydiving. His thought processes were broken by the pilot coming on the intercom with the announcement that the plane would be landing in a few minutes and to fasten your seatbelts. He put the scrap of paper he was writing on into his pocket and thought to himself, now that is a bit of a pie-in-the-sky plan. As the taxi pulled up outside Paul's home, the reality of what was happening struck him. The large real estate sign in the front yard had a sticker across it saying, "Sold." As he sat at the dining room table, staring into the wall in front of him, he realised that he had to do something. So he took the piece of paper out of his pocket and wondered, maybe. He cleared everything off the dining room table, got some paper and masking tape, and started writing down all the things needed on individual pieces of paper. He then did the same thing with skills needed, as well as costs. He placed each piece of paper around the table, creating a timeline, as well as how each item and skills would be linked together. After a few hours' work, the table was covered with pieces of paper, and masking tape linked everything together. This gave him an overall view of the whole endeavour. He started to feel overwhelmed by it, as there was so much to do, and so much of it was well outside his skill set. But, he thought to himself, I can do this. Just about everything linked to one thing, and that was money. He had a mortgage, so the sale of the house would only go a small way towards covering the cost. Paul's brain was in meltdown, so he took a break from thinking about it for a while and went for a late night drive in his old Ford Escort, with the music turned up loud. He would do this when he needed to think. It always gave him a sense of freedom, escape, but not tonight. As he drove through the night, the exhaust echoing the cool night air, he pondered on where he could get such a large amount of money. While stopped at a red light, he looked around at his surroundings. He was in a well-to-do neighbourhood. Large blocks of land, expensive houses, fancy cars, and he thought maybe I should just take it from the rich, a sort of like Robin Hood, but he wouldn't give it to the poor. This idea kept welling around in his head, and by the time he got home he had decided that that was the way to go, even though it was another thing well outside his area of knowledge. Now everything was in place, it was just a matter of it all coming together. The next day Paul had to keep a promise he made to Janet, and that was to go and get Colin, her cat, from the cat home. But while eating breakfast there was a knock at the door. He answered it to find a very attractive woman, with a young man in tow, who introduced herself as Detective Sergeant Elizabeth Bennet and Detective Constable John Young. "Elizabeth Bennet, my goodness, I bet you cop a bit of stick," said Paul. She had a look of "not again" on her face, so Paul continued, "What can I do for the constabulary, and particularly Elizabeth Bennet?" "We are looking into a burglary," replied the detective sergeant. Paul thought to himself, "My goodness, is this an omen?" Paul then invited them in. "I'm just having breakfast. Would you like something? A cup of tea?" Paul said to be polite. Paul then sat down and continued with his breakfast. "No thank you, sir," the detective sergeant replied, somewhat gruffly. "Can I ask you where you were last night?" "Yes, of course you can," said Paul, pausing for a moment. "You can ask me anything. I'm an open book. Are you sure you don't want something? Orange juice? Toast?" She looked at him with a degree of irritation. "Well, where were you last night?" she said, with increasing irritation. "Here," he replied, and then added, "Sit down and make yourself at home." "What, all night?" she said now with a degree of anger, as she looked at her colleague. The detective constable took an A4 size photo out of a folder and handed it to Paul. It was a picture of his Ford Escort taken early that morning. "Have anything to say now?" she continued. "Nice picture. It's such a nice looking car," said Paul, with a bit of a grin. "I think you will find that photo was taken early this morning, not last night. Look, it's even time-stamped. Sorry, officers, I just could not resist that one. I knew what you meant. Yes, I was out driving the Escort early this morning," said Paul. Elizabeth Bennet sat down at the dining room table in front of Paul and said, in a somewhat accusing way, "What were you doing in that area at that time?" "Just out driving. Life has not been all that kind to me over the last few weeks, so I have not been sleeping all that well, and last night, or to be accurate, early this morning, I just went out for a drive. You know, it's a wonderful thing driving a classic car early in the morning when the air is crisp. There's a sort of freedom to it. The sound of the exhaust, Gordon Lightfoot turned up loud. It's a great way to clear your head and get some perspective," Paul said thoughtfully, and then went on to say, "Sorry about pulling your leg. I just could not resist. You two are so serious. And when faced with serious people, I can't help myself. You need to relax a bit." Elizabeth asked, "Did you see any other cars on the road?" "A few, but they were just headlights in my eyes." "What do people call you, Elizabeth? Liz? Lizzie?" "I think it's Lizzie," Paul replied. "Thank you for your cooperation," Elizabeth said, like it was something she had said 100 times before. "Did some rich person," Paul paused for a moment, "get themselves robbed last night?" She got up. "Thanks again, sir," she said, as she and Detective Constable Young started to walk towards the door. "That's all right, it's been fun. I've never been interrogated by the police before. Will I see you again?" Paul asked, while walking to the door with them. "I don't know," she said while standing at the front door, implying that he was still on her list of suspects. As she walked away, Paul said, "I will look forward to our next meeting. I will be moving soon, so here's my new address and contact details, just in case you feel like a chat." And after a pause, "Or dinner." Paul handed her a card. "Thanks, but no thanks," she replied, and walked away. As they approached their car, Detective Constable Young said to Detective Sergeant Bennett, "What was all that about your name? And who is Gordon Lightfoot?" She just looked at him with a look that said, "What has happened to our education system?" Paul closed the door and walked back to the dining table and cleaned away his breakfast, removing the tablecloth, revealing the great escape plan laid out on the dining room table. As he sat there, the seriousness of what he was about to do started to sink in. He would need to limit anything that could leak back to him, like using his own car. As luck would have it, he already rented a garage where he had another old Ford Escort he was restoring. It wasn't rented in an official way, no lease, just cash money. He rented it from an old lady who did not want her pension affected, hence no lease, and just cash. Access was from a laneway, so no one would see him come or go. This would make a great location to operate from. On returning to the police station, Detective Sergeant Elizabeth Bennett reported her progress to her superior. His advice was to cross Paul off her list, as he had no criminal record, and to move on to some of the more likely known criminals. Elizabeth said nothing. She had a feeling about Paul, something about the way he interacted with her. She would keep him on her list. She searched the internet for Paul, and a few things about him and his Ford Escort came up, but nothing else. But something else caught her eye. It was a news report about Janet's arrest. She then checked social media and discovered the connection between Paul and Janet. This in itself meant nothing, but it added to her suspicions. Elizabeth did not fit in well with her fellow police officers. She wasn't disliked, she just had a different way of doing things that sometimes was at odds with her colleagues. Over the next few days, Paul moved to Janet's house, sold many items he would not need, and organised the garage. He set up his timeline and things to do chart on the garage wall and generally organised the garage. He visited the old lady to pay the rent. He paid for the next year, so he would not have to have any contact with her in that time. While there, with her out of the room making tea, he wrote down the internet access number from the back of her modem. This would give him internet access via Wi-Fi with his laptop computer in the garage. He could then search the internet on topics like security items and how to break into safes without it being traced back to him. Everything that could incriminate him would be kept in the garage, and hopefully no one would tie it to him. But if it was to be found, then he would be up the creek without that paddle. Life for Janet was marginally better. She was in a cell with one other prisoner, a young English girl facing the same charges as Janet. They had nothing much in common other than their circumstances. Janet spent her time writing an account of her time in prison that expanded into a story of her holiday. One day blurred into the next, and time passed very slowly, with days passing into weeks. Janet received a letter from Paul every few days, even though he didn't have much to say, but it did make her feel less alone. Paul thought about it and decided that he would need to get a number of false identities, and to give himself even more protection, he would form a company, so that things like cars and a plane could be in the company name, and the company owners would be dead people, with some of the false identities being employees of the company. He would keep one of the false identities completely separate, just in case it all went wrong, and he needed to disappear. All this could and would be unravelled during any investigation, but it would take time, and that time might make all the difference. Paul spent a lot of time in the State Library, looking through old newspapers, reading the births, deaths and marriages. He was interested in the years around the year of his birth, and was looking for people who died young, so he could take on their identities. Once he had a list of potential names, he looked back further to discover their parents' names, importantly the mother's maiden name, because with these he could obtain a birth certificate. He used the birth certificate to open bank accounts. With both of these he then obtained driver's licenses, so he now had a number of new identities: Matthew John, Ronald Hughes, Glenn Donnelly, Dennis Fisher and Graham Haynes. He needed to come up with a backstory for them, just in case. Keeping it simple, he decided to make the backstories the same except for their jobs. They would be 42 years old, single, Ronald would be a mechanic, Glenn a carpenter, Dennis an accountant, Graham a teacher. Matthew Johns would be the identity he would use if things went bad and he needed to disappear and start a new life. Setting up a company was a lot easier than he first thought, because it was all completed online, and so after filling out a few forms, he had a company. He then opened a bank account in the company name, which would help him hide money. He called the company Janet Investments. He just about lived in the garage over the next few weeks, on the internet, researching security systems, safes, flying, sailing, and navigation. But learning how to do something and actually doing it were two very different things. He purchased a number of security systems to use them as training tools. He then spent hours trying to bypass the systems till he could not only do it, but do it under a time limit and in the dark with gloves on. But security systems were just a small part of what he needed to learn. Lockpicking was another skill he would need to master. Like with the security systems, Paul spent hours perfecting the art of opening a door in the dark, wearing gloves. The final problem was how to open a safe. There would be two styles of safe he might come up against: old style with gears and tumblers, and modern style electric safes. The old style safes would require a lot of practice with a stethoscope, but the modern safes would need special electronic tools. Now these were not something Paul could just buy at the local electronics shop, but he did find a how to make one on the internet. The internet is a wonderful place. He even found out how to make smoke bombs. The next order of business was to buy a nondescript car. He bought a 5-year-old Ford Falcon from a private seller and transferred it into the company name. This would be the car he used while doing anything of an illegal nature. You can practice all you want, but at some point it's time to do it. Paul had reached that point, so he decided it was now or never, or as a well-known politician once said, it's time. But before that he needed to pick a target, or, as they would say in the movies, case the joint.
Copyright 2022. To listen to or read more chapters, go to www.yellowduckmotorsport.com. Click on Books, drop-down menu, then click on No Matter What. To listen to more chapters or to read, click on Chapters.